when this issue is brought up in the mainstream, it's usually brought up as a one-time medical decision that parents make and never have to think about again. And that's not the relationship that people have to their bodies. Certainly not the relationship that men have to their genitals, right? It's something that's going to impact someone for the rest of their life, and it's going to impact them in the most personal and intimate ways possible. So it's going to impact their sexuality. It'll impact their relationship to their body, their feelings, their relationship to their family. And so it's not a one-time decision that just you never have to think about again.
This is Meredith for Real, the Curious Introvert, and I'm Meredith. I explore the questions people think but don't ask out loud, either because they're taboo or thanks to cultural hypnosis. My mission, and yours if you choose to accept it, is to inspire curiosity by exploring the nuance and paradox of our world. Each episode is different, so bring your ADD and your earbuds and have a look around. Hey Curiositors, it's me, Meredith. This episode is one of those subject-first episodes. I've been interested in the topic of American circumcision for a while now, but I haven't been able to find the right guest. Thankfully, I found Brendan Marotta. You'll hear us talk about the reason people don't want to even talk about this, the history of how it started, totally not Bible stuff like you'd think, why you don't see outright pro-circumcision people in medical authority, and consent versus coercion. This is one of those trust me episodes. Trust me, it's good. So if you're new here, stay curious. And if you're a regular, thank you. Making a show with new topics every week confuses the algorithm and can make growing the show a challenge. But it's curiositors like you who make it possible. Remember, if you think of someone while listening, share this episode with that person. This helps me grow the show and spread the message of curiosity. If you're on Overcast, the share button is the box at the top right corner with the arrow sticking upward. And if you end up liking this episode, you'll also like the one about another strange American custom we accept as normal, child marriage. It's episode 48. And if you are new here, welcome. Around here, we press play to get curious, disrupt the algorithm, and grow into better humans. We talk about everything from love to landfills, so bring your ADD and your earbuds and have a look around. There's no specific order to listen to episodes. You and your partner are expecting a baby. You announce the pregnancy with an adorable photo on social media and hold a gender reveal party that manages to not cause a forest fire. You decide cloth versus disposable diapers, breast versus bottle feeding. Finally, you can take a break from decision making. But wait, what about circumcision? It may be surprising for Americans to learn that most of the secular world does not practice circumcision. And while the U.S. is a leader in the idea of personal agency over one's body, we also lead the way in routine non-religious circumcisions. My next guest is a filmmaker whose feature-length documentary, American Circumcision, won multiple awards and can be found on Amazon and YouTube. And today, we're going to talk about the surprising history of circumcision and the practice that goes on today as we ask the question, why do we continue to perform male circumcision on non-Jewish boys in America? Now, this is one of those episodes that I ask you to lead with curiosity instead of judgment. And well, if that doesn't work for you, you could just make a drinking game out of it for every time we say foreskin. Author, filmmaker, social change maker, Brendan Marotta. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I think I first thought about the idea of male circumcision in the way that we're about to discuss when I was 19, which is kind of a weird time for a girl to think about like circumcision. But I had just learned about the practice of female genital cutting in other parts of the world. And I was reading like survivor accounts and, you know, of course, horrified. I'm totally horrified at this thought. And I keep reading, and then something calls it female circumcision. And that's when the light went off for me. Like, wait a minute. How are we like rallying for the cause of ending this practice in other parts of the world. And yet we are performing this practice in my part of the world. It was a very eye-opening moment for me. And it's one of the reasons that people have a hard time even talking about this issue, right? It's kind of like a sticky nest of peripheral thoughts that prevent you from even getting to the core idea. So you having done a lot of work in this area, a lot of research, I would love to hear kind of some of those peripheral, we'll call them thought barriers, that prevent that conversation from even happening.
Yeah, the ethics of this are really very simple. It's that cutting off parts of children is bad, and we shouldn't do it. We should leave them whole and intact. That's the bottom line. And absent all of the other cultural ideas that people have around this, that would be a very simple and obvious message. I think if anyone told you as someone who's having a child that your baby's going to be born whole and perfect and there's not anything that you need to do, that would be a really relaxing and relieving message to hear. You know, that children just need love, not surgery. And yet there's all these cultural things around it that I think perform a sort of cultural hypnosis on people, where the way that we think about, for example, female genital cutting, and by the way, I've interviewed survivors of female genital cutting for my film, and they compare male and female circumcision in their testimonies. They say that the ethics are the same. Some survivors of female genital cutting even say that there are forms of male genital cutting that are worse than female genital cutting, or worse than certain forms of female genital cutting. But that occurs in a different cultural context. It is something that people in other parts of the world are doing. And so it's very easy to look at what other people do and point out their wrongdoing. And I think it's much harder for people to look at their own culture and their own family and say, okay, well, maybe there's things that we're doing that we could change as well. And it's also all of the emotional things that exist around it. You know, if you accept the idea that this practice is wrong or that it's harmful to children, well, what does that mean about the people you know? What does that mean about your own family if they did this to you? There's all sorts of psychological barriers that people have, you know, things that we very readily accept as childhood abuse or abuse of children. There's all sorts of psychological barriers that those people have to acknowledging it, even around something like hitting. Well, you know, my parents hit me and I turned out fine. You'll hear people say things like that. Well, something like this, it's an even greater harm. And all of the feelings that might come up around that are things that people have psychological defenses against. And so there's that aspect, there's the cultural aspect, there's the language that we use. You know, I think if people called it holding down a child and cutting off part of their body, it would have a very different reaction than the euphemism of circumcision, which sounds like it's something, you know, less harmful than it actually is.
Yeah, it sounds medically
and
necessary
so all
when you
of
say
these
it that
things,
way.
right? And so there's this whole discourse and language around it, and all of these sort of, you know, cultural ideas that are very, you know, the truth is often very simple, but lies are often very complex. And it takes a lot to sort of deconstruct those various pieces of misinformation that people have around this. And I mean, even the idea that this is a medical issue rather than a human issue, I think is one of the things that we have to change our thinking on. So when this issue is brought up in the mainstream, it's usually brought up as a one-time medical decision that parents make and never have to think about again. And that's not the relationship that people have to their bodies. Certainly not the relationship that men have to their genitals, right? It's something that's going to impact someone for the rest of their life, and it's going to impact them in the most personal and intimate ways possible. So it's going to impact their sexuality. It'll impact their relationship to their body, their feelings, their relationship to their family. And so it's not a one-time decision that just you never have to think about again. It's actually something that the analogy I use is like throwing a stone in a pond. It's going to ripple out through every aspect of a person's life. And it's going to impact their partners. It's going to impact their relationship to the people around them. It's going to impact their own relationship to their body. And viewed that way, it's a much more significant issue. And I think if there was any other issue that impacted, every man in America, every partner of a man, everyone who had kids, that it would be something that people talked about all the time. But because it intersects with sexuality and religion and medicine and all these sort of taboo things, people are less willing to talk about it. And one of the things that I do is, when I bring it up is I don't think I think people have a lot of fear around this. And it's once you actually start to understand it and feel whatever feelings you have around it, they're done. Like, you have the understanding now. And like any other trauma or thing that someone might want to clear in their life, once you explore it and you see it, you're done. And it's actually the resistance and the psychological defenses that people have that are the thing that takes a lot of energy to keep up. In other words, if someone is in denial about an aspect of their life, they have to stay in denial their whole life. And that takes a lot of energy. And it's actually much easier to just acknowledge it, feel that, and then move on.
That's so interesting. I like that you call them psychological barriers. I think that's the perfect description, because they are important to work through. They're very real, but they are a barrier to the also real issue of, in this case, secular male circumcision in America, when the rest of the world is definitely not doing that. And I think, when you're talking about, I think American masculinity, that kind of cowboyism of American men to think of themselves as a cutting survivor, that I think many men might feel that would be in some way emasculating. That might be like the most gentle way to say it. I think some men might find that whiny and ridiculous. And so they would be disinclined to mourn a foreskin they never had, or haven't had their whole life, basically. And so I could really see how that would be a barrier, along with what you mentioned or alluded to, that kind of American exceptionalism. Like, oh, that's like people over there, those people, oh, such barbarians, we're like, no, this is a sign that you are, of an industrialized society. It's medical prevention. It's a sign of civilization. But in reality, we're calling the same thing that happens over there, potentially barbaric, yet here it's civilized. And that is a hard pill to swallow.
You asked at the beginning of this why it continues, and I think it continues because there's a very strong cultural system of psychological defenses. In other words, people have individual psychological defenses, but cultures also develop certain defenses. And certainly people who are profiting from, doing this practice benefit from those defenses. And so you brought up the issue of men and masculinity. It takes a lot of courage to speak about this issue. It takes a lot. And if you think about the traditional masculine role is that you protect your children, right? If someone wanted to do anything like that to a man's child, to cut off a part of someone's child, I think most men would respond with a very strong masculine response to that. And yet, what the larger cultural system around this does is it frames that as, whining, or as the thing that isn't courageous and isn't the masculine role, when in reality, that is the primary masculine role, is to defend your children. And so there's a way in which I think the people who perpetuate this on some level unconsciously know that being strong is a very important value to men. And so they try to frame standing up to them as something weak. And when in reality, standing up to your entire culture when they're engaged in wrongdoing is an incredibly courageous thing to do and requires a lot of strength to do. And they also frame the talking about it as like individual whining, as if this is just an issue that affects only one person, that every man who speaks up about it is only speaking up for himself, not speaking up for everyone who's harmed by it. Not that his action of speaking up for it is actually benefiting his children, benefiting the others who've been harmed. That is actually the action which is not, which is benefiting others, not just that individual man. And what benefits the individual at the expense of everyone else's safety is to say, well, I'm fine. To say that to ignore the problem or silence the problem in some way because it's uncomfortable to talk about it, right? If you think about it that way, that's an incredibly weak thing to do, to not speak up for an issue that's impacting so many, that harms children, that's continuing to do that. And yet the cultural framing that's been created is a psychological defense against people speaking up. It's the same, by the way, I would say the same ethics there for women who speak up about female genital cutting. For a woman to speak up about female genital cutting in a culture that practices that, we see those women as very brave, as activists. And I think also that speaks to our different relationship between men and women's bodies, that women's bodies are sort of seen as very fragile and in need of protection, whereas men's bodies are kind of expected to be harmed in various ways for the benefit of the larger culture. Men are expected to do things like die in war. They're expected to go work dangerous jobs. And so harm, which is completely unnecessary, which benefits no one, kind of gets slipped into all the cultural constructions that exist around that. And it's also, in those cases, a man might willingly choose those things as an act to protect or benefit in some way others he cares about. But this is something that benefits no one, except for, maybe the people who are profiting from it.
And I definitely want to talk about, the harm part, because I think a listener, as they hear you say, oh, something that harms children, especially parents, right? Poor parents, they're guilt-ridden enough, I swear. But I feel like we should definitely talk about the reality of what happens when a baby is circumcised. So we'll get to that in a second. But let's start at the beginning, the very beginning, if we can, the history of circumcision. Where did that all start? I think that'll give us a good perspective of where we are now.
So it began as a medical practice during the Victorian era. And we could go back further. Circumcision actually didn't, as a religious practice, didn't start in Judaism or the Bible. It goes back further than that.
It goes back further.
A lot of anthropologists. Yeah, that's why in the biblical text they introduce it as an idea that already exists.
Oh.
And a lot of anthropologists think it was a substitute for child sacrifice. In other words, people were killing their children as an appeasement to gods. And they said, well, what if instead of, killing children, we just mutilated them? And if you think about it, like, that's like a step forward in human progression.
Okay.
Maybe it was like many thousands of years ago, it was a step forward in human progression. I'd like to think we've advanced a little bit beyond that, but we'll get to that. And so it began as a medical practice during the Victorian era. And again, up until then, it only existed in religious cultural context, not medical. But what Victorian doctors claimed was that masturbation, it was a cure for masturbation. They thought that masturbation was the cause of a great many moral and physiological ills. And they said, well, if we just cut off the most sensitive, pleasurable part of people's bodies, then, we'll stop this harmful practice. And of course they did, and no one does that anymore. But one of the other things that they were proposing at the time, they were talking about doing the same to girls with carbolic acid. There's all sorts of weird things that people were talking about that time as a cure for this. And if you read their texts at the time, they're really quite dark. I mean, you have to think about, it's one of those things where people will write about this and laugh, oh, those Victorians, they were so crazy. But like, these are adults talking about cutting off parts of children's genitals and trying to institutionalize this in a certain way. And I used to think the thing I'd always heard about reading about this history is like, oh, it's just, the Victorians were just crazy and they had all these weird ideas about sex and they sort of saw it as this like low class bad thing. But I read a bit by the philosopher Michel Foucault writing about the history of this at the time. And what he argues is that like these are educated men. They know that, masturbation is a normal human activity. They know that you can't actually end this. And that the real purpose of these campaigns was to gain power over children's sexuality. In other words, before then, parents were the primary decision makers on children. Children were seen as sort of the property of their parents. And so by inserting this, quote unquote problem that the doctors need to fix, they made parents sort of act as surveillance for the doctors. In other words, the parents were supposed to watch their children, make sure they didn't engage in this dangerous habit. And then the moment they did, call the doctor. So there's a problem that only the doctor can fix and the parents kind of have to act as intermediaries for. And it's one of the ways that the medical system starts to gain power over people's bodies and especially children's bodies. And if you look at how the medical system relates now, it's very similar. Like if there's a problem, you call the doctor. It's not that you as an individual have, sovereignty over your own body. It's not that you as a parent can actually understand and solve your children's problems. There's a very similar relationship now that exists between parents and children and pediatricians. And if you go through that sort of look at it sort of not as just all these crazy Victorians, they know they were doing, but look at it as, okay, maybe they did know. And it was not about the things that they were claiming, but about the power that it would give them. A very different and in some ways darker picture emerges. So that's how it began. And then, of course, as time went on, the claims for it changed over time. So, initially it was thought that it's reduced sexuality and that was somehow a good thing. And then after the sexual revolution in the 60s, that claim sort of goes away because it's not a popular thing to say anymore. So it somehow benefits that or reduces sexual transmitted diseases. At one point, it was claimed to cure epilepsy. The claims sort of change over time. But the fact that people are profiting from it and that they're gaining power over children's bodies with it remains the same. And I think you mentioned earlier, parents are sort of racked with guilt about this. And there's a discourse that the medical system has where they claim that that circumcision they'll claim is a parental choice, right?
Right.
But parents don't really make a choice here. I mean, they didn't choose to train doctors in this. They didn't choose to manufacture the circumcision devices that are used. They didn't build a massive cultural norm around hospital birth. And, the hospital system at one point demonized midwives and claimed that they were all these different things, which we now know home birth is in many ways safer than hospital birth. Hospital birth often involves a lot of unnecessary interventions. They didn't build a giant sales funnel around hospital birth and then insert circumcision in that sales funnel. The medical system has this intense pressure it exerts on parents. And because this huge system, and at the end of that system, which has made all the decisions for them, the parents have to sign something. And then the medical system says, oh, well, you made the decision after we did high pressure sales techniques on you. And some surveys show that parents are asked, 8, 9 times whether or not they want to do this, even after they've said no. And I think in any other context, if someone was trying to get another person to consent to something and they had someone that person really cared about captive and they wouldn't let them go until certain requirements were met. And they were asking that person 8 or 9 times to consent to something. And there was a power differential between them. And in some cases, the moms are still on drugs from giving birth. And so the other person they're asking for consent from is on mind altering medication of some kind. That person finally relents and consents. In any other context, we wouldn't call that consent. We call it coercion. And I don't think that this is a parental choice. I think it's very often what happens is that there's parental coercion to get what they call consent, what they frame as consent. Again, it's a very rarely informed consent. Most parents don't know anything about what the procedure actually entails or the long-term impact it'll have.
Yeah, it was interesting reading the American Academy of Pediatrics statement on it and the CDC statement on it. Like I tried to bounce around and look at different websites to see what the recommendations were. And between the CDC and the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, they basically said their 2012 statement. In 1971, by the way, I guess the AAP said, hey, this isn't really necessary. But then in 2012, they said that it isn't, it is up to the parent, that the benefits outweigh the risks, but that it is not recommended as a routine procedure. Let's pause for a quick break from our sponsors. When we come back, you'll hear the dilemma of the Equal Protection Clause and the difference between absolute versus relative risk when it comes to the current argument that circumcision prevents HIV. If you ever wonder where I find guests for the show, the answer is it varies a lot. And since it's something that gets asked a lot, I started including the backstory of each episode in my Monday emails. And then on Saturday, I share cliff notes and clickable links in case what you heard was so good you wish you could have taken notes. If you want to be included, text REAL to 66866 if you're in the US, or go to meredithforreal.com if you're elsewhere. If you're listening north of the state of Georgia, mosquitoes are not top of mind right now. But if you're in the Florida Panhandle or Gulf Coast of Alabama, you're already dusting off your grill and citronella candles. Make life easy for future you and get your property scheduled for a mosquito treatment with Insect. I've been using them since 2019 and they continue to impress me. They guarantee their work and pollinators are always top of mind. Check them out at ensec.net. If you watch the show on YouTube, then you see the beautiful backdrop of Trader John's, the exhibit where I record the show inside the Pensacola Museum of History. This is just one museum under the umbrella of the UWF Historic Trust. If you're planning a trip to Pensacola and need an indoor activity option, pick up a ticket. It's good for a whole week. Get your tickets in person so you can show the agent one of my emails and get $2 off an adult ticket. Now back to the show. Remember to stay till the end where I give you a sneak peek of next week's episode. All of those words.
Also say in that statement they don't know how to quantify the risks. So whatever those risks are,
so
for sure that weighs them.
Can you talk about relative risk versus absolute risk reduction? And because this is, I think, one of those, I don't know, it's even more than a psychological barrier, right? This is like whatever the next level of barrier is, because people think, well, wait, I want to actually protect my son from HIV or from a UTI or whatever else they're, saying, hey, this does help.
Yeah. So a really simple analogy for relative versus absolute risk. If you're indoors, your relative risk of being hit by a meteor is probably down thousands of percents. And your absolute risk of being hit by a meteor is probably really low. That's probably not going to happen to you. But, you should probably stay indoors all the time because your risk of being hit by a meteor, relatively speaking, is thousands of percent lower. That's kind of a way of thinking about it.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, I can go through all of the science on this. I studied it for my film. I interviewed people about it. But at the end of the day, most people are not making decisions about their bodies and sexualities based on, percentages of HIV transmission rates in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Like it's when people bring up this data, I think it's what you might call a fake because. It's like, oh, well, that's the reason. And now I don't have to think about it. And really, they wanted a reason not to think about it. And that sort of was the excuse that their mind could latch onto that someone gave them. And, when it comes to female circumcision or female genital cutting, we don't evaluate it. Like if someone came to you and said, well, I heard it reduces the risk of UTIs to have it, that, you'd be like, get out of here. Like, that's ridiculous, because we understand that when it comes to women's bodies, the ethics are, what does that person want for their own body and what do they consent to? And I think that's especially, the other thing here is it sort of gets, there's a framing difference where this is a child's body and it's also a man's body. And I think the way that people perceive children and also perceive men is very different. And what I notice is that in the discourse around this, the dominant society sort of picks and chooses the things. So it's like, well, it's a child's body, when we're talking about who has the right in certain situations to consent for them. And also when we're talking about sexuality, we don't have to think about that because it's only a child. But when a man speaks about it, like there's sort of a different discourse and sort of pick and choose what they want from each one, not acknowledging like there's a continuity between them, right? If you do something to someone as a child, it will impact the man they become as an adult. So yeah, I mean, I can go through all the different individual science things there. The change in policy statements is, I think, largely due to internal stuff within the organization. In other words, when people hear that, they think that these are, objective medical bodies, not political organizations that various people are vying for power within. So the 1970 statement was put out by one group, and then a Jewish pediatrician who has written poetry about how wonderful circumcision is, took control of the next committee and released a very pro-circumcision statement. He's in my film. You can see him in there.
Oh, I think I remember him now.
And yes, he's got a bow tie.
There were there weren't very many pro-circumcision people in the film. Maybe they just didn't want to talk about it. But the ones that were, I was like, you guys are not that convincing. I was really hoping like, okay, yeah, let's do another strong argument from the other side. You kind of like that, especially as when you're conducting a thought experiment, like answering the question, why do we circumcise boys in America? But there weren't. I mean, it seemed more like they were just trying not to get sued, honestly. It wasn't like a super strong argument.
Yeah. The biggest pro-circumcision voices are in the film. It's just that there are very few anymore that are pro-circumcision. And what they will instead frame themselves as is pro-parental choice.
Oh.
They'll say, well, parents want to do this for all of these cultural reasons, and they should be allowed to for all of those cultural reasons. And if you talk to the parents, they say, well, we've been told for many, many years by doctors, this is the medical thing. And so there's a kind of thing now where there's sort of playing hot potato with the blame. Like, no, you're the ones who did this. No, you're the ones who did this. I feel like the blame squarely falls on the people who have billions of dollars and have been using that for many, many years to promote the practice and profit from it. That's just my perspective. But there is also a sense in which, any wrongdoing that occurs, there's complicity in it. So there's not like, if someone participates and they're only participating a little, they are responsible for their role in that system. But they might not be the only factor in that system. And so what tends to happen is that people will say, well, I'm just, doing my job for the hospital. And the hospital will say, well, we're just giving the parents what they want. And the parents will say, well, we're just doing what the doctor told us to do. And the reality is that they're all in some way complicit in it. It's just that they're all not solely responsible for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it really does. It's like the issue itself is pretty simple, but it's all these other things around it that make it complicated. Because when you say, or when they say it's a cultural decision, it's a decision of the family. Okay, if you put that argument in the framework of people in a faraway place, it doesn't hold water. It's like,
it's very easy to see when you're standing outside the problem, right? Like,
totally.
We can look at any other culture in the world that we're not a part of and go, oh, well, you've got all these problems here.
Yeah.
And then, it's like whenever you talk to someone about their own problems, they're like, I just can't. It's because they're too close to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the same thing.
That's so true. Well, yeah. As a non-parent, is that even like a way to describe a person? Hi, I'm a non-parent, but we'll go with it. I'm a non-parent. And I just had no idea of like how this even, like the process of circumcision, right? And so in your film, when they were showing the little baby restraints that they use, horrified. And then in preparation for our discussion, I read that, tell me if this is true. Do they really just give the baby sugar water on a pacifier and not anesthetic on their genitals?
It varies. Sometimes they don't even do that. And then sometimes they use what's called dorsal nerve block, which is like 5 injections, which if you think 5 needles on the first day of someone's life in that area of the body, it's, trading one pain for a lesser one, I suppose, but it's still painful.
Yeah.
But yeah, the pain stuff around this is not effective. Any anesthetic takes at least 5 minutes to take effect, and a lot of doctors don't wait. A lot say that they use it and don't. It wasn't used up until very recently in like the mid 90s, basically. And I know, by the way, the film What to Expect When You're Expecting, which is like a big budget Hollywood film with Cameron Diaz and a bunch of famous actors, they were going to get I don't know if it was an R or an NC-17 just for describing what circumcision involves. Like just having an actor state it, they were going to get. They had to take it out of the film because they would have gotten a rating that they couldn't go through with.
Oh my gosh!
So I'm prefacing that because like even talking about it is something like they're gonna. I'm just warning. Like they put the foreskin is actually fused to the head of the glands when a child is born. It's kind of like how your fingernail is fused to your fingernail. So the first step is like breaking that away. That's extremely painful. And then there's a clamp that puts thousands of tons of pressure on it, and it stays on for like 15 minutes. And the child is feeling all this. They're tied down in a 4-point restraint called a circumstraint, which is a real device, and you can look it up. We show it in the film. And it's one of those things that people want to look away from, but the child can't. Children don't have psychological defenses at that age yet. They can't. If they do, they have to disassociate, and dissociating that early in life is a lasting trauma. And there's studies showing that it causes a lasting change in behavior that are even accepted by pro-circumcision organizations. So it's extremely painful. And trauma done early in life has a lasting impact.
Wow.
Yeah. And of course, if you leave your child intact, then they're fine. Like there's nothing that needs to happen at that point.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I had a question. It just left me because I was like thinking about the little baby. Oh, so hard to think about. Oh, I know what it was. Physical ramifications of circumcision. So, I mean, that is very traumatic, and people will argue the babies don't remember it. I think in many circles, we're kind of beyond the baby doesn't remember it. For other things, maybe circumcision has that, again, psychological barrier. But I think for a lot of things, we are starting to understand that trauma lives in the body, and it not only lives in the body, but it's passed down through generations. So let's just assume for time's sake that the audience understands that kind of basic framework. But on the physical side of things, are there negative physical impacts of being circumcised potentially, whether that is, a botched procedure or just kind of things that we all accept are, I don't know, like normal-ish?
I mean, the biggest that people talk about is a reduction in sensation. So the foreskin is the most nerve-dense part of a man's body. People think it's the head of the penis. It's actually the ridge band of the foreskin has the most nerve endings. And on men who are circumcised, it's often the scar line. And by the way, if you are circumcised, you can do a test on this. Just like run your finger along the part above the scar and the part below, and the part above is likely more sensitive. And that's the remaining foreskin. That's the remaining inner lining of the foreskin. So it's one of those things where people are like, well, I don't know what I'm missing. Like you have to actually just tune into your body. But there's a disassociation, I think, that happens when someone experiences trauma that early, where if someone has experienced trauma, like getting back into the body and feeling sensations in the body can be challenging because might be other somatic things there. So the consequences for each person are going to be a little different. And it's also going to be different because there's not as I've heard some people do, there's not like a dotted line on men that says like cut here, right? Like the amount that is removed or the parts removed are often different person to person. And some people might be left with more sensation than others. And then also the the way that someone feels about that might be different person to person as well. Different people react to trauma differently. One of the people who I think is really helpful to look at on at least the way that it sort of changes the way that people act is a woman named Patricia Robinette, who was circumcised by the American medical system. And a lot of people don't know that female circumcision was at one point at time, it wasn't ever standardized, but it has been practiced in the United States.
I was surprised to learn that it didn't become illegal till 1965.
Yes. And actually, the federal act against FGM was even later than that. So there, and also got overturned recently. It was a court case that was brought. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff around that. But there's a challenge of keeping female genital cutting illegal while allowing male genital cutting, because that violates the Equal Protection Clause. And so the federal law against female genital cutting was overturned recently, basically on a technicality that they said, oh, this is a state's issue. The states have to ban it. But I think it was also an attempt to avoid the fact that the defense was going to make that case. And they're going to say, like, look, it's our religious practice and we have the right to do it. And they were going to make a whole argument around that. But anyway, the reason I bring up Patricia is that in her book, she talks about how when she discovered this had happened to her, because, no one told her when she was growing up and she didn't have any, like, seeing other people's bodies to know that that's what was going on. She said that she felt relieved in a sense because she had all these feelings that she didn't know where they came from. This sort of like anger. She said that sexual experiences weren't satisfying for her. So she would go from partner to partner to partner, like trying to find a satisfying experience. And one of the things that she says in her book, she says, a lot of men might experience the same thing. And that things that we think of as normal male behavior might be people who've survived trauma. And if you look at people from culture, part of the challenge is I don't know if there is a culture on earth that doesn't in some way engage in trauma towards their children. But if you look at people from other cultures, they have a different relationship to sexuality. And if you see someone who has an anger that you're not sure where that comes from, or they're going from partner to partner, not having a satisfying experience, can you trace it back to this or not? It's going to depend person to person. And the challenge of studying something like that is there's not you can't split test a population and give them all the same childhood and all the same experiences and find things like that. But I have, after interviewing a lot of people about this, found that there's a lot of men who have experiences like that they didn't realize were going back to this. In other words, they had anger issues. And then they got into some form of somatic or therapy that regression therapy or primal therapy or something like that. And they were like, oh, like now I understand where that comes from. And like Patricia said, there's a relief when you find out, oh, this is where my feelings come from. There is a reason for them. And very often that's the thing that allows people to transform or change and let them go, is when they understand where their trauma comes from. But it's going to be different person to person. And also the impact of I mentioned that there is a reduction in sensation. How does a particular person relate to that or process it? For some people, that might not be what they value. For others, it's a very important value to them that is going to cause all sorts of things for them. But it's going to depend it's hard to evaluate the physical because the physical is tied to the psychological,
Right. Well, and this is such an interesting conversation. Thank you for making this film, and thank you for being willing to talk to me about this because, I love episodes where I can, of course, be like 3 easy steps to blah, 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 but there's none of that here. But what I love about it is that there isn't any of that. It's the question that is just left with a question mark that you are left to think about. And now you have a new filter by which to process those psychological barrier issues, right? So thank you so much for this discussion. Before we sign off, will you tell people where they can find your film and just kind of follow your work, because you are into a lot of really interesting topics. And I love that about you. I love people that don't, kind of pigeonhole into one genre.
I want to add one thing before that, which is that in some sense, it is very simple. And there's a very simple solution, which is keep your kids intact. That's it. It's very simple. Yeah. It's all the other stuff around it. But if you're interested in all of those things, my film is at circumcisionmovie.com. I am at BD Murata, my first two initials in my last name, on every social media platform. I have a Substack called hegemonmedia.com where I write about social justice issues and the treatment of children. And if you follow me on those places, you'll find my other interests in things like novels and AI art and maybe the next film that I do, which are all about completely different things.
Awesome. Thank you again. I really appreciate it. This was really good.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Did you think of someone you know while you listened? Help me grow the show by sharing this episode with that person. If you liked this episode, you'll also like the one about another strange American custom we accept as normal, child marriage. It's episode 48. Stay tuned next week when I celebrate National Introvert Week with an introvert mixtape. The best clips about thriving as an introvert in an extroverted world.